So, very good evening to all of you present here. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you to the third lecture of the series on literary criticism. So, all of you who were there with me yesterday have already seen that we have discussed quite a few important critics. And the very first day, we have discussed the origin of literary criticism, how this idea came to the fore, what are the things which are included in this discussion, because literary criticism is there in your syllabus for net set in English, right? On the screen, you can see my details. You can also see my link of my channel, wherein there are various audio books which you can refer to for various studies. So lecture 3, as I said, will be a continuation of the topics and the points which we were discussing in lecture 2, and we'll go further ahead with the ideas which have not yet been covered. Yes, good evening. I can see quite a few over there. So good morning, all of you. Good evening, all of you. So now the critics whom we were talking about were the Enlightenment age critics. And the first critic whom we discussed, as you know, is John Dryden. Now, John Dryden is also known as the father of English criticism. He was the first to teach English people to determine the merit of composition upon principles. Except an essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden wrote no formal treatise on criticism. His critical views are found mostly in the prefaces to his poetical works or to those of others. And then he reflected on the nature of poetry, wherein he stated that it is a process of imitation. We have discussed this idea of imitation or mimesis in details, wherein we have tried to understand how the concept of mimesis gets evolved and is kind of, it has a different shade for different critics. And in case of Dryden also, he is talking about imitation. And in that, he is talking about that he imitates fast-paced or present popular beliefs, superstitions, and things in their ideal form. He defends Shakespeare's use of supernatural, founded on popular beliefs. And for it is still an imitation, though of other men's fancies in the sense we are talking about the popular beliefs which are being imitated. According to him, poetry and painting are not only true imitations of nature, but also best nature as much as great criticism. Discussing on the functions of poetry, we discussed that he wanted to say that delight and transport are the primary objectives of Dryden, and just instructing is not the main issue. So he talks about, he realized it does not merely imitate life, but offers a beautiful resemblance of the whole. So the word beautiful is important because he is actually a creator the poet is a creator who is creating a new version of the reality which is beautiful. Right. So he is one who, with life or nature as his raw material, produces a new altogether resembling the original in its basis, but different from it in the superstructure, a work of art rather than a copy. And the main ideas which we kind of came across through the conclusion were that he presents a brief discussion on the neoclassical theory of literature. He defends classical drama, and that it is an imitation of life, reflects human nature clearly. It's written in the form of a dialogue among 4 gentlemen, Eugenius, Crites, Lycidius, and Neander, wherein Neander speaks for Dryden himself. Now, Eugenius favors modern English dramatists by attacking the classical playwrights who did not themselves always observe the unity of place, and then the other characters. But we have to remember when we are reading that Neander is basically Dryden who is speaking. So with this, we kind of wrapped up the session, and now I just highlighted some important aspects of that session because we are going to contrast these ideas with the topic which we are going to take up today, which is Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope's write-up or his essay is an essay on criticism. and we are going to discuss this particular work of his. So, an essay on criticism, as you can see this picture of Alexander Pope. This is Alexander Pope's picture, and this is the picture of his work, which is an essay on criticism. We are seeing that it is a didactic poem. When we say didactic, basically it is about, propounding some rules, giving some advices. So it's a kind of preaching something. So it's a didactic poem in heroic couplets. What kind of couplets? Heroic couplets by Alexander Pope, first published anonymously in 1711 when the author was 22 years old. So this is a work which is written in the form of heroic couplets. It's a didactic poem, and it was published anonymously in 1711. Although inspired by Horace's Ars Poetica, this work of literary criticism borrowed from the writers of Augustan age, and in it referring to an essay on criticism, Pope sets out certain poetic rules. And in the form of poetic rules, he is saying that a neoclassical compendium of maxims with a combination of ambitious argument and great stylistic assurance. And the poem received much attention and brought Pope a wider circle of friends, notably Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, who were then collaborating on what? On The Spectator, right? So they were actually, must have heard the name of The Spectator, because whenever we are reading the history of how prose developed, The Spectator plays an important role. So the first of the poem's 3 sections opens with the argument. So this has 3 sections, and it opens with an argument that, what is the argument? That good taste derives from nature, and that critics should imitate the ancient rules established by classical writers. So this is what we have to remember. So the section, first of the poem's 3 sections. So how many sections? 3 sections. And the first of that opens with what? With an argument. And what is the argument? The argument is that good taste derives or is got from where? From nature, and that critics should imitate the ancient rules established by classical writers. Just the way we were reading classical criticism, similarly, he is saying that we need to follow the ancient rules which have been established by classical writers. Then the second section lists the many ways in which critics have deviated from these rules. So the first one, he is talking about the fact that good taste derives from nature, and that critics should imitate the ancient rules established by classical writers. The second section lists the many ways in which critics have deviated. What do we mean by deviated? Have gone away from it. That is, not actually kind of responding to the rules which the classical writers have put down, but have moved away from that. So they have deviated from these rules. In this particular part, Pope stressed the importance of onomatopoeia. So the different figures of speech which are used in the form of writing, in the form of creating poetry, wherein onomatopoeia represents the use of words which respond to that particular sound which we are trying to express. So he is stressing on the importance of onomatopoeia in prosody, suggesting that the movement of sound and meter should represent the actions they carry. So in order to represent the sound, that particular meter which is trying to be expressed, then the best thing is use of onomatopoeia or onomatopoetic words. The final section, that is third section, discusses the characteristics of a good critic concludes with a short history of literary criticism and a catalogue of famous critics. So this is how the third section comes, or kind of concludes this work, wherein it discusses the characteristics of a good critic and concludes with a short history of literary criticism and a catalogue of famous critics. The work's brilliantly polished epigrams example, a little learning is a dangerous thing. So many a times we will see that when we are using, we are just discussing, having a discussion with friends, sometimes we use certain epigrams or, proverbs like, we say that a little learning is a dangerous thing. So we shouldn't feel very proud by learning something, not very in a very in-depth way. But it so happens that people who you will see around you, there will be some of your friends who do not know much about a subject, but they are so confident and sometimes so overconfident that they land up with some kind of problem. So here in this work we get this epigram which states that a little learning is a dangerous thing. Next one is, to err is human, to forgive divine. So we have heard this also. Then fools rush in where angels fear to tread. So fools rush in where angels fear to tread, while not original, have become part of the proverbial heritage of the English language. And why English language? You will see that Marathi or Hindi translations of these proverbs or these epigrams also there, wherein we use it while talking with people on different subjects. Then the poem is originally divided into 3 parts. Part 1 offers general principles of good criticism and of poetry, since criticism for Pope means determining the merit of a work rather than its meaning. So originally when we were discussing about what is literary criticism, we discussed that literary criticism doesn't only mean we are talking about the good thing, but we can also talk about the drawbacks. However, for Pope, when he is talking about criticism, he mainly means it is about determining the merit of a work rather than its meaning, and understanding the principles of good criticism means understanding the rules for good poetry and vice versa. He first cites the problem. What is the problem? That it's with our judgments as our watches. None go just alike, yet each believes his own. So just like the watch, so although it's almost the similar, but then the watch runs as per its own pace. So he is saying that judgment is just like our watch, which is going around according to its own pace, though we all of us are believing that what we are saying is correct, right? So judgments are partial, and true taste is as rare as true genius. So judgments are partial, and true taste is as rare as true genius. So he's saying that whenever somebody is judging something, judgment is bound to be partial. There will be certain elements of your own liking, your own feelings, which will be added to your judgment, making it partial. And hence, true taste is as rare as true genius. So to find a person who is really a genius is really a big problem. Getting a true genius in and around us is a problem, just as the process of judgment, which is also bound to be partial, and getting a very, very impartial judgment on anything is definitely difficult. Some critics go astray through false learning, others through envy of wit. So being proud of your wit, being jealous of your wit leads to judgment which is not correct. So self-awareness is therefore a crucial quality for a critic. Be sure yourself and your own reach, So you should be self-aware. So self-awareness is important for a good critic to give a criticism or to make a criticism which is impartial. So you will see that you go to a party you have your friends, and there some incident happens. So there will be some people from whom you do not know, and there will be one group who is your friend. So anything happens, you are definitely going to pass a judgment which will be in favor of your friends. This is how it happens all the time. So giving a judgment which is, kind of completely uh, based on facts and is not partial is little difficult. Then he offers solutions for this problem. So the first solution is that first follow nature. Nature here means the universe as God created it, that which is permanently true. So he is saying that nature or the natural things around us are the most true things. So we should follow what? We should follow nature or the things around us as God has created them. The second solution which he gives is that learn the rules of old, that is, the precepts of poetry, criticism, set down by the classical Greek and Roman authors or deducible from the literature. Take care, however, not to follow the rules slavishly. What is slavishly? Blindly, without using your brain. So don't do that without using your brain, but rather know well each ancient's proper character, especially Homer. So this is what you need to keep in mind. So learn the rules of old, that is the precepts of poetry and criticism, set down by the classical Greek and Roman authors or deducible from the literature. So he is asking the critics to go back to the traditional, the classical writers and read the precepts of poetry, and that is the rules of poetry and criticism which have been set down by these classical Greek and Roman authors. And then if you are doing that, what will happen is that you will kind of be influenced by that, and your ability to be a good critic, your ability to be a good poet increases accordingly. One reason to be flexible in applying the rules, there are beauties yet no precepts can declare. So, beauties yet no precepts. So, there will be certain things which cannot be declared by any rule. Now, great writers can break the rule successfully. Modern poets should take care, however, that if they break a rule, they should never transgress its end. So, even if you are breaking a rule, you should not transgress its main ambition. What does the part 2 do? The part 2 identifies the main flaws, the main problems a critic is exposed to, and therefore the greatest obstacles to good criticism. So, what are the greatest obstacles to good criticism? That is what is identified in part 2. So, part 2 identifies main flaws a critic is exposed to, and therefore the greatest obstacles to good criticism. Now, the first and biggest flaw in criticism is as unjust, but everything else, that is pride. So, what is the first problem? It is pride. The second flaw is little learning. A little learning makes critics susceptible to pride by making them think they know more than they do. Pope is not praising ignorance here. The cure for the pride of little learning is more learning, which teaches the scholar how little he or she knows. So, the first thing is pride. How do we get pride? He's talking about the origin of pride comes from the fact that little learning leads to pride. Now, little learning leads to pride, and in order to overcome that, what do we need to do? We need to take recourse to more learning. If you are taking more learning, then you will see that people who are very knowledgeable, they will never say that in their mouth. They will say that, there are things which we still don't know. There are things which we need to know. Only the people who are overconfident and think that, yes, I know everything, they are the ones who are going to be very proud of their knowledge. And that is why he is saying that in order to increase your ability of learning, we need to lead to more learning, which teaches the scholar how little he or she knows. The third flaw, that is the problem, is a love to parts. So, focusing on parts, that is emphasizing one aspect of a poem at the expense of all others. So, emphasizing one aspect. So, a critic should instead read each work of wit with the same spirit that its author wrote and survey the whole. So, he needs to survey the whole, not just the part, and regard the writer's end. When we are saying writer's end, we are actually referring to the writer's main ambition. So, you should not consider a work just by its part, but engage in its whole. Fourth flaw is the love of extremes. So, kind of extremes of any kind of thing which is explored. Balance is not there. That is what he wants to say. The fifth flaw is liking only one small sect. Example, foreign writers, British authors, ancients, or moderns, as opposed to approving of merit wherever it is found. So, only one small sect, that is only one portion, one part. The sixth flaw is judging authors according to the opinions of others rather than the merit of the work. Example, judging the name rather than the work. Worst case, judging the work on the basis of social rank. The seventh flaw is prizing novelty above everything else. So, giving more importance to novelty. Eighth flaw is valuing only those works which agree with one's views or written by friends or members of one party, etc. Envy plays a very big part here. So, being jealous. So, you will see that, you are having a cousin whom you are really jealous of, and that cousin has written something and sends you, and you read that and you feel, oh, what's the great deal about it? Perhaps I will write better than that. So what happens is that we become biased, we become jealous, and our criticism, our appreciation, our reading of that particular thing is bound by our own perception. Again, a lens comes in our eyes, a lens of being envious, of being jealous, of being partial to that particular text. So again, if you like somebody, your favorite friend writes something and you want to support that person, then you kind of become a very good judge. You kind of see the positives in it, you appreciate that, and you want to highlight the good things in that, right? So this is how it works. So this is what Pope is saying, that whenever we are kind of valuing things, we kind of see whether it is agreeing with our view or not, whether it belongs to our friends or members of our party or not, or if it is of some other party or not. So accordingly, we are going to maintain our judgment. Part 3 celebrates a good critic and concludes with a short history of literary criticism and a catalogue of famous critics. So, critic has to be moral. First thing, we discussed various flaws in part 2, right? Various shortcomings. Part 3, we are discussing the good critic. We are discussing the things which make you a good critic and the points which you need to keep in mind. So, a critic has to be moral. As a judge, you do not have to create enemies but friends. If you are not sure, do not speak. No one is right all the time and no one is wrong all the time. So if you are not sure, don't speak. And you have to accept the fact that no one is right all the time and no one is wrong all the time. Back to self-knowledge. Pope suggests the importance of self-knowledge. So if you remember, we were discussing that, what happens, you become proud with the very squirrel hoards of knowledge which you have. That is very little knowledge which you have, you become proud. But instead of being proud, what you need to do, you need to have some kind of self-analysis. You need to have knowledge about yourself. And he gives importance to self-knowledge. So know when to speak, even if your analysis is beneficial. It is always best to teach people who are educated in a way that doesn't show them that they are being educated. So he's saying that if you go and start preaching somebody, You have gone to a party and you are actually kind of, you have started a lecture there. Imagine what will be the expression of people who are there around you. They will not want you to continue with your lecture in any form, right? So he is saying that you have to be intelligent enough to make people realize that you are not actually teaching them, right? So very educated people won't really need or want you to educate them. But if you want to say something, you have to say that thing in a very intelligent way, so that it doesn't seem that you are teaching, but somehow unknowingly you are letting these ideas into their mind, right? So nicely express your thoughts. If you are going to teach people, criticize them, but you should not, but you should leave dangerous truth to satire, and you should leave flattery to dedication. Then, too much reading may lead a critic to have a blockhead. If you read too much, you'll start to see similarities everywhere. So, a good critic should do what? Should also avoid mentioning his relationship with authors, even if it is true. So, try to be as impartial as you can. Finally, Pope asks a question about the man who can embody all the qualities of a good critic. And he questions that is it possible to have a person who can be really a good critic, who is going to have all these qualities? And then he says, but where is the man who counsel can bestow, still pleased to teach and yet not proud to know? So he is saying that where is such a man who counsel can bestow, that is, who can be counseled and still he is pleased to teach people and not yet proud to know. So person who is always ready to know things. He is not so proud that he will say that no, I don't want to know. He is proud to know. He is pleased to still teach. So he wants to teach, but he is always open to know. So what follows, Pope does not give a specific answer. Instead, he mentions classical figures that are used as examples. So this is how, through part 1, 2, and 3, Pope gives us the idea regarding what a good critic should do, what a good critic should not do, and gives us some lead into how criticism should go ahead. With these points, we'll move on to the next topic for the day, which is Ben Jonson. So, Ben Jonson is among the best known writers and theorists of English Renaissance literature, second in reputation only to Shakespeare. A prolific dramatist and a man of letters, highly learned in the classics, he profoundly, that is immensely, influenced whom? The Augustan age through his emphasis on the precepts or values of whom? Horace, Aristotle, and other classical Greek and Latin thinkers. While he is now remembered primarily for his satirical comedies, he also distinguished himself as a poet, preeminent writer of masques, erudite defender of his work, and the originator of English literary criticism. Jonson's professional reputation is often obscured by that the man himself. So what does this mean? That he was himself as a person, his personality was that he was bold, he was independent, and he was aggressive. So he is saying that more than his professional reputation, the man himself was more influential in his time. He fashioned for himself an image as sole arbiter of taste, standing for erudition and supremacy of classical models against what he perceived as the general populace's ignorant preference for the sensational. So he believed that he had a particular status, and he emphasized on the supremacy of classical models. Now, while his direct influence can be seen in each genre he undertook, his ultimate legacy is considered to be his literary craftsmanship, his strong sense of artistic form and control, and his role in beginning, as Alexander Pope notes, critical learning into vogue. So he contributed immensely to critical learning, criticism, and the way we should analyze or critique a work of art. So he is a classicist of English criticism. What are his critical works? Discoveries or Timber, and he advocates order and discipline in writing. So order and discipline is something which he wanted in his writing. Now, what are the things which he wanted regarding the status of English? So he wants English to be raised to the excellence of Greek and Latin. So he wanted English to be raised to the excellence of Greek and Latin. Greek and Latin referring to the classics which were there. So he wants to kind of improve the status of English and take it to the level of Greek and Latin. English literature worst because of excessiveness in passion, imagination, and expression. He even talks about Shakespeare here. So he is saying that English literature is occupying a position below the classics of Greek and Latin tradition because there is excessiveness of passion, imagination, and expression in English literature. So, consequence of ungoverned impulse. So, impulse which is not governed. So, there will be impulse, there will be emotion, there will be passion, but it should be kind of governed and not ungoverned. He follows three unities. As we were saying, that some critics follow three unities, some critics do not follow three unities. He belongs to the particular section which follows three unities. Subject of a just work, neither too vast nor too minute. So, the kind of work should be just. What does he term the poet as his idea of a poet? So he calls poet as maker or feigner. So somebody who is feigning, who is imitating, who is kind of putting up a face, right? So he calls poet as a maker or a feigner and calls poetry as fiction or the thing feigned. So what does he call poetry as? Poetry as fiction or the thing feigned. Then he states that poetry is the queen of arts. And this requires or has 5 requirements. What are they? Nature, exercise, imitation, study, and art. So these are the 5 requirements of a good poet which are enlisted by him. Then he talks about the style. So, noble censoriousness, 3 requirements for good style: to read the best authors, to observe the best orators, exercise of his own style. Ready writing makes not good writing, and familiarity of language is important. So, if you are using language which is completely unfamiliar to the people, that is again a problem. There should be familiarity of language, language which is familiar in nature. And ready writing makes not good writing, so that writing should be a product of good reading. What kind of reading? When you read the best authors, you observe the best orators, and you exercise, your own style, then that is what makes you attain a good style. Then let us discuss the important points which we need to keep in mind. So Ben Jonson is a poet and dramatist than a critic. So his reputation as a poet and dramatist is huge. There is plenty of criticism in his poems, plays, prefaces, and his dedications. Timber or Discoveries is one of his famous critical work. And in all his criticisms, what he wants is that he wanted writers to write well, not by chance, but knowingly. So he wanted the writers to write well, not by luck, not by hook or by crook, but by knowing that, yes, I am writing a good work. When do we have that? For example, you're preparing for NET. How will you be 100% prepared? When you put in your best, right? So when you prepare your best, that is when, that particular work, whatever you are doing, comes out or has a result which is the best. So all Ben Jonson's plays are modeled on the Latin drama. In his criticism, he follows Aristotle and Horace. So he in himself is saying that you should follow the classical writers, the important thinkers, because if you do that, you will be a better critic, you will be a better writer. So here he himself also followed the model of Latin drama, and he follows Aristotle and Horace. So Discoveries is a collection of notes that he made from time to time. So he makes few notes. These notes come in the form of his write-up, which is Discoveries, and these notes are made from time to time. Johnson did not like the classic for their own sake, but he wanted to raise the English standards on par with the Greek and Latin. So Johnson did not like the classic for their own sake, just for their own sake. But what did he want? He wanted to raise the English standards on par with Greek and Latin. So the way he said that, it can be done is that by removing what? The excess passion, imagination, and expression which is there in the English literature. So if we could remove the excess passion, imagination, and expression, then that could actually lead to a better standard of English literature, which could bring it on par with the Greek and Latin literature. Right? So these are the important points which are to be covered when we are talking about Ben Jonson. Now we are going to move on to discuss certain important thinkers who have also contributed to the world of literary criticism, and some basic idea regarding them is also important. First is Thomas Hobbes. So, born in 1588 in Westport, Wiltshire, England, died in 1679, Hardwick Hall, Derbyshire. He's an English philosopher, scientist, and historian who is best known for his political philosophy, especially as articulated in his masterpiece, which is Leviathan. So, yes, good evening, Harshavardhan. So, we are saying that, whenever we are doing or reading any piece of literature, we get references to these thinkers and their works. And one of those important thinkers is Thomas Hobbes, whose work Leviathan is very famous. And you must have heard about its name whenever you have been in literature classes or you have been preparing, right? So Hobbes viewed government primarily as a device for ensuring collective security. So he viewed government as a device for what? For ensuring collective security. Political authority is justified by a hypothetical social contract. Hypothetical means something which is imaginary, something which is kind of thought of. Hypothetical social contract among the many that vests in a sovereign person or entity the responsibility for the safety and well-being of all. So, political authority is justified by a hypothetical social contract. So, we have to remember that there is the reference of a social contract, which is a hypothetical social contract. And political authority is justified by this hypothetical social contract. And it is amongst the many that vests or that kind of gives importance or puts that power on a sovereign person or an entity, the responsibility for the safety and well-being of all. We should give our obedience to an unaccountable sovereign, that is a person, a group empowered to decide every social and political issue. Otherwise, what awaits us is a state of nature that closely resembles civil war, a situation of universal insecurity where all have reason to fear violent death and where rewarding human cooperation is all but impossible. So, what does Leviathan give us? According to Leviathan, it is about a kind of a government is viewed as primarily as a device for what? For ensuring collective security. So, in order to bring about collective security, Hobbes views government as a device whose main aim is to seek collective security. Now, political authority, the authority which this government is having, the political authority which the government is having, is justified by a hypothetical social contract. A kind of, imagine, social contract amongst the many that vests, that is, that puts in a sovereign person or entity the responsibility for the safety and well-being of all. And the sovereign person is basically a person or group empowered to decide every social and political issue. So it's the government which is doing this. And the fact which is made to believe is that if we do not accept that, then what awaits us is that it is basically a state of nature that closely resembles civil war. So if we are not following this, then what resembles is a situation of civil war. Next is John Locke. So John Locke was an English philosopher and physician, widely regarded as one of the most influential of Enlightenment thinkers and commonly known as the father of liberalism. So he is known as the father of liberalism. Considered one of the first of the British empiricists, following the tradition of Francis Bacon, Locke is equally important to social contract theory. So his work greatly affected the development of epistemology and political philosophy. Locke's theory of mind is often cited as the origin of modern conceptions of identity and the self, figuring prominently in the work of later philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant. So the people who have worked related to philosophy, related to mind, related to the idea of identity. So Locke's theory of mind is one of the primary works which have played an important role. Now, Locke was the first to determine the self through a continuity of consciousness. So he was the first to define the self through a continuity of consciousness. He postulated that at birth the mind was a blank slate or tabula rasa. So when a person is born, the mind is just like a blank slate. Contrary to Cartesian philosophy based on pre-existing concepts, he maintained that we are born without innate ideas and that knowledge is instead determined only by experience derived from sense perception. So a concept now known as empiricism. So he is saying that the concept of which is there in our human mind that is developed after we are born, but as we are born, the mind is completely blank. It is just like a blank slate or tabula rasa. So empiricism emphasizes the central role of empirical evidence in the formation of ideas rather than innate ideas or tradition. So empiricism emphasizes what? The central role of empirical evidence in the formation of ideas rather than innate ideas or tradition. So he gave the theory of the idea of empiricism. Next comes Giambattista Vico. So Vico's intellectual magnum opus is the book. What is the name of the book? Scienza Nuova or New Science. So this book he has written, which attempts a systematic organization of the humanities as a single science that recorded and explained the historical cycles by which societies rise and fall. So, this is what this book talks about. The Latin aphorism, Viram es ipsum factum, that is, truth is itself something made, coined by Vico, is an early instance of constructivist epistemology. He inaugurated the modern field of philosophy of history, and although the term philosophy of history is not in his writings, Vico spoke of a history of philosophy narrated philosophically. So, this is what the main contribution of Vico is in literary criticism. Then comes Edmund Burke. So Edmund Burke was an English political philosopher who is often seen as laying the foundation of modern conservatism. So conservatism, that is commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change or innovation. Right. So Burke was an English political philosopher who is often seen as laying the foundations of modern conservatism. Although he supported the American colonies in the revolution against the British crown, he strongly opposed French Revolution, the rise of unbridled democracy, and the growing corruption of government. So when did the French Revolution actually start? 1789. So it gave Burke his greatest target. So he expressed his hostility, that is, he expressed his feelings where in his work, Reflections on the Revolution in France. So we see that Burke was against the outbreak of French Revolution. He opposed the French Revolution. And in order to talk about it, in order to talk about this cause, Burke, his greatest target, he expressed his hostility in Reflections on the Revolution in France. So the book provoked a huge response, including Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. Now, dear students, you need to keep in mind this book, Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. This is also very important. And many thinkers have been influenced by reading Thomas Paine's book, The Rights of Man. So Burke emphasized the dangers of mob rule, fearing that the revolution's fervor was destroying French society. So why was he against French Revolution? The reason why he was against French Revolution was that he felt that the French Revolution was actually doing what? Was actually destroying the French society. And that is why he was against French Revolution, and he spoke about his feelings in his work, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And this book had a huge response, and one of the most significant responses were Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. So he appealed to the British virtues of continuity, tradition, rank, and property, and opposed the revolution to the end of his life. So he appealed to what? He appealed to the British virtues. What are the British virtues he appealed? Continuity, tradition, and rank, and property. And he opposed what? The revolution. Which revolution? The French Revolution, to the end of his life. Next is Edward Gibbon. So Gibbon was an English historian and member of parliament. Gibbon is often referred to as the first modern historian. Gibbon's objectivity and accuracy, that is, keeping aside subjective emotions, is the use of reference material, became a model for the methodologies of 19th and 20th century historians. His important work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So you many times get question as to who has written this, what is there in this. So was published in 6 volumes between 1776 and 1788. So history is known principally for the quality and irony of its prose, its use of primary sources, and its open criticism of organized religion. So what is history mainly known for? The quality and irony of its prose, its use of primary sources, and its open criticism of organized religion. It covered the period of the Roman Empire after Marcus Aurelius from just before 180 1453, including 1590, and attempted to explain why Roman Empire fell, outlining the behavior of the political decisions that led to the decay and eventual fall of the Roman Empire in the East and West. Next is Adam Smith. So, Adam Smith was a Scottish economist and philosopher who was a pioneer in the thinking of political economy and key figure during the Scottish Enlightenment. Seen by some as the father of economics, the father of capitalism, he wrote two works: The Theory of Moral Sentiments and an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Now, this work is usually known in a short form, which is The Wealth of Nations. Now, it is abbreviated as The Wealth of Nation, which is considered as his magnum opus. That is his main work, his great work, and the first modern work that treats economics as a comprehensive system and as an academic discipline. So, what does it treat? Treats economics as a comprehensive system and sees economics as an academic discipline. So Smith refuses to explain the distribution of wealth and power in terms of God's will and instead appeals to natural, political, social, economic, and technological factors and the interactions between them. So he actually started a whole new age in the field of literary criticism, and he influenced the economists. He influenced the field of economics to a great extent, and his work, The Wealth of Nations, is considered as his magnum opus. So with this, we come to the end of the discussion of this particular phase of critics, and now we get into the romantic age of critics, who play a very important role in the study of literary criticism. The first literary critic who is there for this particular field is William Wordsworth. So he's such a famous poet. All of you know about him. And you must have come across his ideas regarding to criticism as well in the preface or in the summary, wherever you have read about that particular poem. So after the French Revolution, what happened is that Romanticism did what? Romanticism has actually shattered the old way of life. The old way of life which was existing earlier, that was shattered. It discredited the old hierarchies, the existing hierarchies which were there. What did it do? It proclaimed the rights of man. So if you remember the book which we were saying, Pine's The Rights of Man, which is important, that they were reconfiguring man at the center of discussion. They liberated, the Romantic age, which began after the French Revolution with the publication of, the works of these two great Romantic poets, that is Wordsworth and Coleridge. So they liberated the man from class divisions, no longer regarded kings and princes the noblest subject of poetry, no longer kept decorum as the special purpose of the poet. What became the subject of poetry? So according to Wordsworth, the principal object of poetry is to choose incidents and situations from common life. So this topic is very important because William Wordsworth's criticism is one of the important areas wherein you can get very many questions. So, to choose incidents and situations from common life, to select language really used by men. So, these points you should know by heart, because these are very, very important points which are to be kept in mind for the purpose of literary criticism for net set. Now, to throw a certain coloring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. To make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them the primary laws of our nature. So, by tracing the primary laws of our nature, we should kind of focus on the subject. Then the language of poetry, when we were discussing, it should resemble the common dialect, the way a human being, the way common people speak. The romantic view of what language the poet should use is completely different from the new classicists, because we see that romanticism, the romantic age, is talking about people. They are kind of going against the division of something superior and inferior. So, new classical writers avoid rustic language, but we see that Wordsworth is talking about using actual language which is used by the common people. So, he is supporting the rustic language. They attempt to refine and polish ordinary language. Thus, poetic diction has replaced ordinary speech. So the romantics use the language of ordinary men, especially rustics, that is, the people from the villages, the people from the countryside. So their dialect, that is their way of speaking, which is not at all polished, that is what is included as the language of poetry. So this is the marked difference which we see from the neoclassical writers and the romantic writers. So they are using language which is completely different. Neoclassicists avoid rustic language, but the romantics, they want to include rustic language. They attempted to refine and polish ordinary language. Thus, poetic diction is including ordinary speech. They are using ordinary men, especially rustics, and Wordsworth is not interested in the manners of those who live in the city and the court. He wants poetry to deal with what? The essential passions of human heart. So this is very important. He is talking about the essential passion of the human heart. And language of poetry, man in nature is better than man in the city. Nature is referring to the countryside, it's referring to the people in the villages. The passions of men in nature are incorporated with the beautiful and permanent forms of nature. So, Wordsworth considers language of the farmers as the best, because they communicate with the best objects. That is, what are the best objects? The natural things, nature around them, from which the best part of language is originally derived. So Wordsworth rejects the neoclassical rules of poetic diction and the personification of abstract. For him, these rules are artificial. So which rules? The neoclassical rules are artificial. How does he define good poetry? So according to him, good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So good poetry, according to Wordsworth, is not the utterance of commonplaces in metrical language. So we see that he goes against the neoclassical idea of using particular poetic diction, going and talking about something abstract, but he is talking about using the language of the farmers. He is talking about using the language of the common and ordinary people who are living between nature, because he thinks that nature, when you are between nature, when you are there with nature, something beautiful comes out of it. So you will see that when you are not feeling good, you are down, and you want some kind of refreshment, you are suggested to go near nature. You are suggested to go to a hill station, or you go somewhere outside the outskirts of the city. When you are there with nature, you learn something which is new, something which is good, which refreshes you. and which empowers you with some positive vibes. So Wordsworth is also stating the same thing, that he is saying that we have to, kind of use the language which is the language of the man in nature. And who better is there with the nature other than the farmer, who is all the time with nature, who is taking care of his farm, his fields, and is kind of coming across with a language which is best suited, according to Wordsworth, for poetry. And then he goes on to talk about what is poetry, what is good poetry. And this line, you should, all of you, I think you already know. If you don't know, then you should know it very well. Who told this? The spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So this is how he defines good poetry. So good poetry, according to Wordsworth, is not the utterance of commonplaces in metrical language. Rather, it is what? It is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? So this is how we have discussed the main idea of the idea of poetry. And then in the next lecture we are going to take this ahead with the definition of poet and the definition of poetry as propounded by Wordsworth. So what exactly he wants to say, and how his theory kind of starts the new age of romantic literature or romantic poetry. So, any questions you can ask me? If not, we will call it a day for today. So, any questions? If not, thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. See you all in the next session. Have a great day ahead. So, any questions, you can put it up in the chat box. If not, thank you. If you want to be in touch with me, be in touch with me on my channel. The description is there in the very first slide of the presentation. Thank you so much.